Hi, my name is Shaylynn Hayes-Raymond, and I am a licensed counseling therapist candidate in New Brunswick, Canada. I recently finished my Master of Arts in Counseling Psychology at Yorkville University, and I have been a web and graphic designer for 10 years. I have an honors diploma in creative digital media. I have spent a lot of time in the space of digital media. I have a bachelor's in political science, and I spent a lot of time thinking about computer science issues there, not like doing computer science, but the ethics of computers and the ethics of how they are used in our society. So, cyber politics is usually what that is called. And I almost did a master's in cyber politics, but instead I ended up in the moving from the political sphere into counseling. But as a person who really cares about data security and who cares about ethical data security, I really wanted to do this presentation for other therapists who might not have as much marketing background or as much computer background or political background. I've also been an advocate for my disorder, misophonia, for the past 10 years. And through that advocacy, I have had to do a lot of these things as I run numerous websites. I think right now I'm still managing about 20 websites despite leaving the field. So all of that aside, I do want to start this presentation today on ethics in, you know, therapy and digital e-practice. But even if you are not in an e-practice, this can be helpful because many who are practicing now are using their computer, whether they are practicing digitally or not. So if you are using social media to find clients for your physical practice, or if you are using, social media to engage, email is digital. So record keeping, all of these things are important to think about if you are a therapist in the modern age. So unless you are, doing everything on paper and locking things in a cabinet, I think it's very important to think about the ethics of data and the ethics of the use of computers and technology in the therapeutic space. So the title of my presentation is Ethical Considerations for Telehealth Therapy. And I already told you a little bit about myself, and here is my bio here. You can read that if you like. I'll give you a few seconds, but I think I kind of touched on most of it. So, ethical considerations of e-counseling. Researchers and the CCPA, which is the Canadian Counselling and Psychotherapy. Oh my God, I'm really bad at acronyms. Researchers and the CCPA are aligned on what makes e-counseling ethical. Informed consent, data security, privacy, competence, and an understanding of jurisdictional laws are the most common ethical concerns of e-counseling. Counselors should always be willing to follow current research on e-counseling and keep up to date with the best security and modality policies. And you can see there are references down below. So basically, research is evolving and e-counseling is kind of a new field. Think back 10, 20 years ago, the idea of going to a therapist on your phone or computer were crazy. No one was doing that. Nowadays, a lot of people are. And of course, we saw a rise of this with the COVID-19 pandemic and with things having to move online. But still, a lot of people are realizing that this is a better situation for them, whether that's the therapist or the people seeking care. So this is a self-assessment to see what your current beliefs are on psychotherapy online. And, you can just kind of do this yourself if you like. I'll kind of give you a minute, or you can pause the video. So for this self-assessment, For each statement, identify the response rating that most clearly aligns with your beliefs and attitudes. 5 is strong agreement, 4 is a moderate agreement, 3 is undecided, 2 is moderate, and 1 is a strong disagreement. So for number 1, you would choose effective counseling services can only be delivered face-to-face. So you would choose how you feel. And going on, so on, contact with clients through email should be discouraged due to privacy and confidentiality concerns. 3, any ethical concerns regarding online counseling are secondary to the benefits of being able to provide services to marginalized individuals who may not be able to attend counseling in person. 4, counselors who wish to provide online or counseling services should be required by a regulatory body to take additional training in the delivery modality. And 5, to avoid jurisdictional and legal issues, online counselors should only provide services to clients in their province of residence. And hopefully these questions will all be answered through this presentation. But if you really want to think about these and think about how you personally feel about these concerns. So the top 5 ethical arguments in favor of online therapy include an increased access to psychotherapy and service availability and flexibility. And of course, that includes rural areas, more northern areas of the country, places that simply just don't have counselors in person. Or maybe there are people who work different hours or who are a marginalized community and don't feel safe with any of the therapists nearby. This can also be helpful because you have a wider range of options online. Therapy benefits and enhanced communication, advantages related to specific client characteristics, as I just said, convenience, satisfaction, acceptance, increased demand. Obviously, if there's too many people needing therapy in an area that only has 1 or 2 therapists, there isn't enough time for everybody. And economic advantages, which I kind of think is a half and half, because I honestly think the argument for economic advantages is a little low because a lot of online therapy is often the same price because therapists still have to use rigorous standards. They might even need to have more software, etc. There isn't a brick and mortar building, but depending on the situation, some brick and mortar therapists, they have a split or they have a rent agreement, but some online therapists do as well. So I will say that the economic advantages might come more out like if you have to travel instead or stuff like that. But I think honestly, that one can be a bit of a wash, and there's a misunderstanding of online therapy where people think it's, cheap because it's a computer. So, top 5 ethical arguments against online therapy. Therapist competence and need for special training. And that is part of why I'm making this video today, because I honestly do agree that there needs to be more competence in this area. Research gaps, obviously it's new and emerging. Emergency issues. I will say that in Canada, therapists are not normally emergency providers anyways. So this is more of an American issue where we're looking at diagnosis or crisis care. Most Canadian therapists, especially in a private practice setting, don't really have to worry about the emergency issues. Privacy, confidentiality, and security. This is the big, big, big one. And that is what most of this is about today. And honestly, I think most of these research gaps and competence and everything are really revolving around privacy, confidentiality, and security issues, because these are the core of what is so different than in person. Because, in person, you can close the door, you can lock it. And save for someone having a camera in the room that you didn't know about, there's less going on at a time. You're just in the space, you do the appointment, and then they're done. But online, there are so many other factors. So communication issues specific to technology. And this can both be communication issues in a privacy and confidentiality way, or a tonal issue. Say you send an email to a client and they can't understand your tone, you're just being professional, but they might take it that you're being cold and disengaged. So it's much harder to communicate sometimes in these spaces. Obviously, video and audio are the easiest, but using online or other methods of therapy, such as, texting, does change the tone, and communication is already something that interfere with therapy. So it's one thing to consider. So where you can practice e-counseling. So this is a question that I had the beginning of my program, and all the way to practicum, I was vigorously researching, both as, a person who's able to digitally practice and researching, who do I ask? And it was really funny because I was like, should I talk to an employment lawyer? Should I talk to, the people ahead of who are heading regulation? And eventually I came to terms with the fact that there are not a lot of even lawyers or resources that tell people how and where they can practice in Canada. So as you can see, there's a map on screen. Everywhere blue is an unregulated province. Red is regulated or in the process if Alberta. Orange is also regulated. They just have kind of different rules. So you can technically practice in any province because therapy in Canada is not a healthcare issue. It is a job issue. And in Canada, they are not allowed to tell you where you can work. We do have a right to work in different provinces, no matter what the ethical boards say. But when you are in a regulated province, things change. First of all, say you live in New Brunswick, like I do. That means that you have to adhere to all of the laws for New Brunswick. Now, New Brunswick does adopt the CCPA Guide of Ethics, so it is very consistent with CCCs, so Canadian Certified Counselors. So in New Brunswick, I can sit here and if anyone from across the country asks for therapy, I can see them. Now, what is different is I cannot advertise to these. So say I'm going even on Facebook and I'm making an ad, therapy services available in Canada. I can't say therapy services available in Alberta, Nova Scotia, Ontario, Quebec's PEI. I can't say New Brunswick because I live there. Now, I can still accept clients from these places, and you do have to look specifically at each province because Prince Edward Island, for example, has a % of clients that you're allowed to have out of province. Now, one thing here that's really important to remember is you have to go by your regulatory body. So if you're in Ontario, you need to see if SERPO allows you to see people out of province. I believe they do, but you also have to go for the rules in the other province. So if you're in Ontario and you are counseling someone in Nova Scotia, you have to go by Nova Scotia's rules for your client, even if you are in Ontario. Because if we remember, our governing boards are to protect the public, not the therapist. So the public interest comes first. And very recently, like this week, as I'm recording this, there is no longer tax on therapy in Canada. So luckily that is no longer an issue. You don't have to think about, what tax do you charge in each place? It's just zero across the board. That is excellent. So I do want to give some advice as someone who has made advertisements in the past as a marketer for 10 years and as someone who is thinking about this ethically as a therapist. So if you were to make an ad saying that you offer therapy, what you can say is you can make a general ad and put it, generally to the country. You can exclude Facebook, and most places will let you exclude provinces you're not allowed to advertise in. Obviously, I would recommend that since you ethically should not be marketing to regulated provinces based on the rules that are posted. And what you can also do is say where you are located in the post. So if someone happens to see this from, say, Ontario, even though you didn't target it, say someone shared, to their friends and their friend happened to be in Ontario and they want to see you as a provider. If you have on your post something like therapist in New Brunswick, Canada, licensed by the CCTNB, then this tells that person, A, who you're regulated by, who they go to if there's any concerns, And they then have this choice to choose a therapist in New Brunswick, but you have not solicited them as an Ontario citizen. They have come to you. So, acceptance of e-counseling and telehealth. I am actually very, very passionate about this issue because with misophonia and misokinesia, I have a fight, flight, freeze disorder. So I cannot sit in the room with another person because of leg shaking, chewing, tapping, pen clicking, all these things. I just get very uncomfortable. So I don't think I would currently have the career that I have, especially not as director of the International Misophonia Foundation, without having access to online work. So I am very passionate about this, and I do think that it is a accessibility issue in general. And I personally am of the mindset that this is a very important way forward, and that if there are any ethical concerns, we should focus on alleviating them and developing best practices, not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So, on the acceptance of e-counseling, it's been seen as a viable alternative to in-person counseling, but this is relatively new. As we said before, COVID-19 led to a lot of counselors having no choice but to adopt digital practice, many who probably never would have. And now, though, what COVID-19 and this new use of e-counseling did was it allowed for actual research on the subject. So there is some research on whether or not it's viable now. So Barker et al. In 2022 concluded that so long as the counselor uses their code of ethics, is competent in telehealth, and considers the needs of the personal client, that telehealth is viable. So informed consent is something that we all understand by now. And just like informed consent in person, there needs to be informed consent regarding technology. And there are a few more things that need to be added for this form of informed consent. So clients must be told the data collection policies and if records will be digitally stored. Clients must be informed of which platforms will be used. Clients should be informed if email/text messaging is appropriate for anything other than payment and booking. Explicit permission must be sought for all digital forms of communication. And that informed consent means that this client needs to know, is the email encrypted? Is text messaging encrypted? Which, by the way, the answer is often no. And even if it is yes, the answer becomes no, because, no plan survives first contact. The second you send out an encrypted email, it is no longer encrypted when the person receiving it hasn't encrypted it. Maybe they do, but most people are, using regular run-of-the-mill Gmail, Outlook, Apple, etc. So encryption, you can have the most encrypted email in the world, the best standards, but that doesn't mean that your client does. So the CCPA created a 35-page guide for telehealth, and it is a very useful guide, and they came out with it in 2019 in March. So obviously it seems like, I don't know if they already had this in the works for a while and they just were kind of like, oh my God, we got to get this out here now, or if they did have to rush this through, or if, it just happened to come out in March 2019 anyways. So unfortunately, there's not a lot of classes and workshops developed on e-counseling since it's new, and that's part of why I'm passionate about the topic. And therapists practicing telehealth will need to be vigilant in following new policies, research, and laws in the field. So these are going to be ever evolving, as are all things in, counseling. And I think it's very important as therapists that regarding technology, we understand that we don't live in a bubble, that just because something is normalized in our lives, that doesn't mean that we necessarily are thinking about all the implications that this technology can have. Just for like an example, just an out of the blue. Now, ethically, as a therapist, we would never send out our clients' information or sessions online. But what would you do as a therapist if, unbeknownst to you, your client recorded your entire hour-long session? And yes, this is possible without hearing Zoom say, recording in progress. Someone could have software on their computer that is running that records the meeting. and say they record both audio and visual and they post the entire thing on their YouTube. Now, aside from having a panic attack and perhaps, not wanting that client anymore, most regulatory bodies protect the client, not the therapist. So we'd really have to think, ethically speaking, how to go about this. Would you file a DMCA takedown claim based on copyright? Is the therapy session something that should be owned by the client? Or is this explicitly written in your consent form that if there are any recordings, they must not be shared by either party? So I think that's something you really need to consider and really need to write in there, because if you have not explicitly talked about it, generally speaking, especially if you live in, say, a province or an area that has one party consent, it might be your client's right to record your entire session, post it online, and let people watch that. And I mean, that sounds like an anxiety-inducing nightmare, but that's something that people might not consider could happen. But in the digital age, your entire therapy session could end up in little clips on TikTok. So instead of letting that happen, because obviously we would never do that ourselves, but who knows what our clients will do. So I think, having these conversations about privacy and about also not only the client's privacy, but the therapist's privacy as well, and the sanctity of therapy. I think those are important guides. And, legally speaking, I think you need to have a contract, and that is based on business more than it's based on ethics of practice. But I do think that that is an important thing to consider, because the client may not realize this, but they may come back to regret having their therapy online. You can't say whether or not they will, but I think most therapists would rather that not be out there, even if they're really confident about their skills. So, research gaps in telehealth. So since this is so new and only recently grown in acceptance, there's very little literature on the topic. So this should really be considered when choosing a modality to practice through e-therapy. I mean, it might be really hard to do certain types of therapy through the computer. I mean, I could not do pet therapy and have you touch my cat through a webcam. You could have your own cat and I could instruct you, but you know what I mean. So the modality and its appropriateness to telehealth is something that we really need to look at and follow the research as it grows. There have been some, modalities that have been tried and true and tested online, and those are usually things like CBT, which don't seem to matter if it's in person or online. But these are things that are ever growing, and, find your PubMed subscription and keep on reading. Emergencies. So this topic for, emergencies, it's kind of difficult because in Canada, we don't necessarily provide emergency care the way they might in the US. But in order to comply with certain laws like duty to warn and mandatory reporting, we should have their legal name and address on file, and if possible, verify this with an ID to make sure that your client is your client. Now, if you are storing these things, oh my God, make sure they are heavily, heavily, heavily encrypted. I do recommend that if you check an ID, that you have it checked through a secure encrypted form and then delete the file after you have checked that that person is who they say they are, because having an ID leak is first of all an ethical consideration, but also imagine if that were you and your therapist was the reason that your ID got out into the world. That would probably make you not trust therapists forever and ever. So reporting laws should be considered for both ethical jurisdiction and where the client is. If there's a discrepancy, obviously you should go to supervision and talk about that there. But I will say that it is quite likely that where the client resides is going to be what the law is, because all these bodies protect the public, not the therapist. So for clients with suicidal ideation, an emergency plan should be established, which is the same as in person. But, like all things, you do what you can. An emergency contact is very important in those cases. You might want to, verify that the emergency contact is real as well. I've had to consider using duty to warn and research in another province, unfortunately, through practice. I didn't end up having to go through with it, but it was something that I was in a situation where I may have. So you want to have researched this ahead of time in case you have to report something to somebody so that it's not a surprise. And you have to tell your clients about all these things and what you will do in the case of something like this happening. Like, say you recognize that a child is being abused, you need that client to know that yes, therapy is a safe space and yes, you are there for them, but there are certain limits to what you can, you know, deal with as a therapist and how you will have to, report things if they come to light. And unfortunately, this is a reality that we live in. And I had a situation where I learned that there was neglect, and it wasn't neglect for the sake of abuse or anything like that. It was a chain of events that someone's mental illness was causing neglect to a teenager. And, you know, I had to have a conversation and say, either we find a way and a plan that we can address this, or I'm going to have to report this. And luckily, she was able to come up with a plan. But it was difficult because we were physically in different provinces. So I had to really consider, who do I contact? How do I contact them? When do I call them? Legally, what are all the things that go on with this? So these are huge, huge, very deep considerations. So, in emergencies, rely on your licensing board and provincial requirements, as well as the licensing board and provincial requirements of where your client is located. And when in absolute doubt, supervision, if it's really bad, lawyer, obviously. Finding lawyers, I find, in this career space is actually much harder than I anticipated. So I would suggest looking for a lawyer that's associated with your governing board or your insurance, because it can be very hard to just in general find a lawyer that has these competencies. So on that note, additional liability insurance. So insurance, this is a fun topic. Everyone hates insurance, but I highly, highly, highly suggest that anybody who is practicing in a sphere of the internet get the individual cybersecurity and privacy liability. It is extra. It is something that is usually not included in your normal package, but cybersecurity is so hard to keep up with that I would absolutely never practice without it. I think that it would be, I don't know what exact word to use, because I don't want to say necessarily unethical, because that is based on your board guidelines, but I do think that it's kind of dumb to not have cybersecurity and privacy liability if you are using any form of technology in your practice, whether you have a physical practice with digital billing, if you're using, phones, or if you're a full digital practice. I think in all of these cases, you absolutely must have that type of insurance. And I can't think of a situation where you wouldn't, unless, you're working for somebody else and they're paying for cybersecurity for you. So I do highly, highly suggest getting that. So healthcare information and personal information, important acronyms. The first is PIPEDA, and this is the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act. This is Canada-wide, but excludes provinces who created their own laws. And it's a privacy act for all businesses in the country, which does include healthcare. And sorry, my PowerPoint's a little messed up. It was supposed to have the name at the end instead of in the middle, but oops. So PHIPAA refers to the Public Healthcare Information Privacy and is only applicable in Ontario. And now I suggest having both PIPEDA and PHIPAA in place if you plan to practice cross-country and might even have a person from Ontario, or if you are in Ontario, obviously you will have to follow PHIPAA. I just think in general that you should do both because the best security is always better. In the United States, they have HIPAA, and HIPAA is the legislation for healthcare. It is much stricter. US data must remain in the US for emails, websites, etc., with all partners like web hosting signing an agreement. This doesn't apply to PIPEDA and PHIPAA. Some provinces might want you to have all your data in Canada. I think it's a good idea to do so anyway for your own peace of mind and knowing that the web hosting and practice managers that you're dealing with are in Canada is a nice thing to have as extra peace of mind. You don't absolutely have to, but I do think that it is a good way to go. And I will personally recommend Web Savers, and I'll put a link down below because they are Canada based and they are highly secure, and I love their service because I do feel like it is a level of protection much higher than, say, having a website on GoDaddy or Bluehost or Squarespace or something like that, because, you know, security is very important, even if you're not getting that much data. I feel like no matter what you're doing, you want to have the most stringent security possible. So PIPEDA is Canada-wide legislation impacting all industries. As I said, it's a federal law and it dictates how data is handled. Unless information reaches multiple provinces, PIPEDA does not apply to Alberta, British Columbia, or Quebec, nor Ontario, but these provinces are like, they completely threw out PIPEDA. These provinces have their own privacy laws that must be followed. So if you're in them, refer to your provincial legislation. So as I did say before, PIPEDA is a bit complex. There are several principles, and honestly, I would say that they are all important. So principle one is accountability. An organization is responsible for personal information under its control. It must appoint someone to be accountable for its compliance with these fair information principles. And if you are in private practice alone, that will usually fall on the counselor. Principle two, identifying purposes. The purposes for which the personal information is being collected must be identified by the organization before or at the time of collection. Principle three, consent. The knowledge and consent of the individual are required for the collection, use, and or disclosure of personal information, except where inappropriate, which I don't know where that would be inappropriate to not ask for consent. Maybe if you're, you know, running a website and someone is simply using the website, you don't add a consent form, but I think it's always good to even have like terms of use in that case. So that would be a question for a lawyer because I think consent is always important. Principle four, limiting collection. The collection of personal information must be limited to that which is needed for the purposes identified by the organization. Information must be collected by fair and lawful means. Yeah, so you can't just like buy scraped data and then say it's your own. That's not good. So principle five, limiting use, disclosure, and retention. Unless the individual consents otherwise or is required by law, personal information can only be used or disclosed for the purposes for which it was collected. Personal information must only be kept as long as required to serve the purposes. Principle six, accuracy. Personal information must be accurate, complete, and up-to-date as possible in order to properly satisfy the purposes for which it is to be used. Principle seven, safeguards. Personal information must be protected by appropriate security relative to the sensitivity of the information. Principle eight, openness. An organization must make detailed information about its policies and practices relating to the management of personal information publicly and readily available. Principle nine, individual access. Upon request, an individual must be informed of the existence, use, and disclosure of their personal information and be given access to that information. An individual shall be able to challenge the accuracy and completeness of the information and have it amended as appropriate. Principle 10, challenging compliance. An individual shall be able to challenge an organization's compliance with the above principles. Their challenge should be addressed to the person accountable for the organization's compliance with PIPEDA, usually their chief privacy officer. And I'm sure reading through this, you may have noticed that there is a lot of overlap with the ethical boards for therapy and with PIPEDA. So Canada does have some very stringent laws. And I do think it's great that it applies to all businesses. Sorry about that. Excuse me. So resources for Ontario-based therapists, a guide to the Personal Information Protection Act, frequently asked questions, and it differs from PIPEDA as it's based on healthcare. However, in Ontario, PHIPAA is a supplement to PIPEDA, not a replacement, which is why in the previous slide, I did not say that Ontario was excluded from PIPEDA, because it is not. So communication considerations and email. Oh my God, email is such a tough topic. And I want to go on like a little tangent, first of all, for email, unrelated to sending emails for the sake of communication, but as a marketing purpose. I have marketed for 10 years. I am a professional in the industry. And I was on my practice manager and it said link to MailChimp. And I nearly had a heart attack for a second. And I realized, okay, yeah, it is okay for therapists to build mailing lists. I've seen other therapists build mailing lists, but for the life of me, I couldn't get on board with the idea of sending mass emails to potential therapy clients or past clients. I understand its use if, you're sending out like a general policy update for the practice and you need a manager for several clients. I get that. But as for sending out like marketing, we have slots open, or 10 reasons you need therapy this summer, I think that is highly unethical, and that comes from a person with a marketing background. I guess if you are doing things like this, definitely, oh, sorry, I keep hitting the mic. Definitely check with your regulatory bodies. And I challenge you to sit there and think about if you're doing it to help people find therapy and find help, or if you're doing it to just kind of drum up business and generate income. And I understand that we need to make money. I do, but I think marketing in this field is very touchy because it can become exploitative very easily based on the content that you're sending out. So it's hard because on the one hand, you do want clients, you do want people to find you, and obviously that is important, but just don't send out mass emails begging people to pay you for therapy. I think that is a little disturbing. It's one thing to have like general public ads, but the minute you are like contacting individuals being like, hey, you want some therapy? Hey, you once had a free download on my site, so you want some therapy? This isn't the industry for that. It would be something I would do for my nonprofit because it's fair marketing use, but as a therapist, I think that it's a little dirty. I'm just gonna say it's a little dirty. So other communication considerations in email, and I need some more water after that little angry rant. So the first thing to do with email is ensure your computer is in a secure location. And that kind of feels like a duh, but make sure even can family members access it? Do you have a password? Are you storing client data in a place that, someone can just walk in, see this computer? It won't show the laptop. There's a laptop here. It will not show it. Okay. So are you in a cafe working and you go to the bathroom and your laptop is out? Or are you, letting your access be accessible to your whole family? Things like that. Maybe secure your computer. And I know we all trust, our spouses or our kids, but it doesn't matter about trust because privacy does not just intentions aren't the only important things. So make sure that any data that you're holding, like physically that computer, is protected, or at the very least, you then have to, if someone can get on the computer, they then have to enter more security to get to the next step. So ensure your password is enabled and not easy to guess or override. If you're using text messages or email, ensure that these are either secure or private. Ensure the client consents to all means of communication, that they are aware of any associated risks. For example, SMS text messages cannot be end-to-end encrypted, but some apps like WhatsApp can be. Even Messenger has encryption now. There are some email apps out there that force people to use that app to get the email, and it's encrypted on both ends. But that, might not be good if you're working with populations that are, say, older online, that they can't figure that out. So you also have to take into account the tech savviness of the person you're communicating with. And also remember that the tone of voice can be hard to detect in text and email, and it might influence the relationship. Look into email providers that allow for encryption. You'll likely need a premium service because regular emails like Gmail and Hotmail, iCloud are normally not encrypted. iCloud might actually be. So these are things like Microsoft 365, Google Workspace, Proton Mail. You can go with Zoho, which is a cheap option that is encrypted. Proton is very, very encrypted to the point that some other mail services might even reject email from it. A good in the middle is Microsoft 365 or Google Workspace because they do allow for good compliance with privacy laws without being burdensome on the user. I will say that these things can be complicated to set up, especially if you want to also have a website with the same domain because you use your own domain name for services like this. So this is somewhere where you might want a designer. And I do offer a package on, helping people set up their businesses, and that is always a part of it. But yeah, that's just another concern. So website security, oh my God, as someone who has been a web designer for 10 years, websites are not safe. They're just not. You have to pay a lot of money to have a super secure encrypted website. I'm sorry to tell you. That's why we see data leaks from some of the biggest in the business, because it's just not possible. So that's also another reason to purchase the insurance, because assume you will be hacked. Also, I highly suggest the third point that we'll get to on this slide. So the availability of DIY website builders has led to many businesses to create their own website. And an average of 30,000 websites are hacked per day. And that's actually old data. It's probably higher, but I couldn't find sources from newer. So I believe that was from the Purple Sec 2023, but data handling is much more complicated than plug and play, and an expert should be contacted if you plan to collect client data, credit card payments, etc., through your website. So one way around this is to do like I do at ShaylynRaymond.com and have your website. And then if you do have a form, have that be either encrypted or not take a lot of data, and then use third-party services such as Square or why can't I think of it? Things like PayPal, Square, Stripe, there's the name, to collect payments so that you never have these payments on file. And then having an EHR, so an electronic health platform such as Theranos or Simple Practice. I'm actually with Notero, and I will put a link as well below. I think Notero is amazing because they also accept TELUS eHealth, which counselors in regulated provinces can now actually direct bill on TELUS eHealth. So that is actually why I switched to Notero. These places to keep data give you the protection of a larger company that has more robust security. You're not managing it on your own. you pass off a little bit of the liability and you still have your insurance. So it's just kind of like dotting your I's and crossing your T's, making sure that everything's secure. And these platforms have very robust security measures for handling this data and health. And you just won't. Simply having a web form or an email to get patient data or client data, sorry, like all their health information, their credit card, etc. That is horrific. Don't ever do that. And if you think that, oh, you can just set up a website and do that and it's fine, it's not fine. It's I will say one thing: if you were an American, it would be a HIPAA violation, and they would charge you like $100,000 if you did that. In Canada, we're less stringent and less secure with our laws, but I do think that a lot of this would be highly unethical. So I do believe that we need to ensure that when we are collecting data, that we are doing so in a way that is secure. And, if you were doing it through email, through a form, I would suggest, a PDF that actually has a password. So you make a fillable PDF and then you give a password. I think that would actually be much better than just sending a document if you do want to go kind of a more old-fashioned, simple setup route. Accepting e-transfer is a good way to not get any data. If you are accepting credit cards, make sure you go through a third-party vendor that will handle all that for you. So like Square, PayPal, Stripe, so that you are not handling this data. Because remember, you still have the data to think about, and that is where your privacy comes in hand for credit cards and things like that. So you might think just simply having Zoom is secure because everyone says if you pay for Zoom, you're secure. And it is encrypted, yes, but there are other things you have to do. So you need to make Zoom compliant with the Protected Health Information Annex for Canada, and this will cover you for both PIPEDA, PHIPAA, all of these things. So you must have the paid Zoom. It must be encrypted. And then you go down to the admin settings, you go to plans and billing, you go to plan management, and then you enable the Protected Health Information Annex Canada only. So not only do I highly suggest this, I think you kind of have to do this, in my opinion. Obviously, people aren't going to check if you have, but I think once you know that it exists, you probably have an ethical duty to enable it. So the use of social media, this is such a hot button issue. I have trouble with this one too, because as an advocate, it's really hard to know where therapy begins and human Shaylynn exists. And I think that it's just tough. It can relate to both telehealth and in-person counseling for advertising, engaging with the community. Most counselors are using some degree of the internet for their practice. And Section H6 of the CCPA Code of Ethics reminds counselors that their own personal social media use should reflect ethical boundaries. And that is very vague, and that tells us nothing. And I think that if the CCPA wants to have these stipulations, that they need to be really clear about what they mean by ethical boundaries in social media, because it's an ethical boundary that you don't add a client maybe to Facebook. I can understand why that would be an ethical boundary because that's a dual relationship. But what if you make a post or a TikTok or something and it's not something completely unrelated to therapy? Like, say you really hate Taylor Swift, like you hate her and you write a client, or you write a post on Twitter, which is always public, I hate Taylor Swift, and your client sees it and they come back and they're like, oh my God, you're a hateful person. I can't believe that. So do you have the right to say opinions on social media that might be controversial to your client? I don't know. And I think that we don't have enough information about this. And I really think that Section H6 is just a dangerous use of an ethical guideline, because it's very vague and it could be interpreted in many ways. And I really dislike vague rules that are meant to be followed by entire organizations. So at this point, I would say use your own discretion, and worst case scenario, consult a lawyer with your insurance company to see if they agree or disagree with how you're using social media. So counselors as influencers, and this is a big one for me because is an advocate and an influencer, or are we using just, different words nowadays for things that have always been done? Who knows? So there are ethical considerations that revolve around being a social media influencer and counselor. Parasocial relationships and community members taking your advice to heart is a large concern. So obviously you need to have informed consent. You need to tell people this is not therapy. This is general advice. This is just what I've seen. This is not therapy. And the ability to refer persons commenting, messaging, needing help. Apparently, according to Triplet, that is something that you should be doing. I don't know how viable that is, depending on how many people you have. So maybe you could just have a blanket description that says, if you need help, please go to XYZ. And influencing can include marketing materials on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, or general advice type videos. So there's really no formal line. And this, again, is something that you need to use your own discretion, your own comfort, and rely on the guidelines of your ethical body. If you're with the CCPA, that guideline is very vague and hard to interpret. So I guess don't do anything that you would feel ashamed of if a client saw it. I think that's a good way to think about what's appropriate. Or don't do anything that you would be ashamed to tell your supervisor about. So I think that's a good litmus test. It's before you post this, if my client sees this, is that okay? And I think, that could help. So this is just another little resource. Questions to ask yourself if you want to influence. So what is your intent behind becoming a mental health influencer? Will you provide a disclaimer for the intended scope of your influence? Who's your target audience and how familiar are they with therapy? What professional boundaries will you establish, and how will you communicate the limits of your competency? How will you provide adequate referrals? And what will your plan of action be to provide emergency referrals to audience members outside of your local jurisdiction? I think these are good questions to ask, but I think you also have to really question if some of this is even feasible, and maybe it is and maybe it isn't. So I think tread with caution when you want to be in these fields. So that is my presentation on ethics of telehealth therapy. And if you are a therapist and you are interested in a website or, getting started in your own digital practice, I do offer both business consultation and a fully inclusive digital practice starter pack. And I can just show you that right now. And obviously the purpose of this is not to sell you a class or to sell you this, but I do want to let you know that it's available if you want it. So this is the starter pack. It's $1,000. It includes a fully functional website, help setting up your online billing, help setting up your portal, help setting up social media, and it gives you lifetime access to the website theme. They're usually $200 a month, and just kind of gives you everything you need to get that digital practice running. Of course, other than your fees for posting and, your platform and stuff like that. So that is available. I do also do one-on-one consultation for businesses. But the take-home message I think I want people to have is that you should not take on every hat. You should always, talk to an expert, learn about these technologies you're using, learn about their practical uses, but also learn about the implications that they have for you as a therapist and for your clients. So, hopefully, this has been a helpful presentation. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.